Greetings all, my name is Jason. I'm the support operations manager here at GitLab. And today I figured we'd go over the, Zendesk Salesforce Sync for the main Zendesk instance. This is what handles the vast majority of the syncs from Salesforce to Zendesk on the, the main instance, not the US federal. This also doesn't handle like partners, the open select, the alliance. This just handles our customers, our priority prospects, our former customers, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll just kind of start going over the script. And yeah, share my screen. Cool. Real quick, anybody watching, can you verify you can see the script and it's readable and all that stuff?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, fun stuff. I am not hearing, so second, stop the share and actually fix my stuff. All right, let me share again, and this time see if somebody can confirm if they can hear it or if they can see it.
Yes, I can see it.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, now I've got audio, so that's what I needed. All right, cool. So these run out of the ops GitLab instance. The reason for that is they do show customer data in the CI/CD pipelines. So for the greatest amount of access control we could do, these currently run out of the ops instance. They're very access controlled. Not a lot of people can see them. I do have plans in the future to mirror them to like the toolbox or something, so that the code's at least visible, with the caveat of like, obviously it won't run through this code through the toolbox, but it will at least be visible. So this is our basic README file. There's not a lot to this other than it tells you kind of what gems it's using. JSON, which is arguably more of a library than a gem, but it's also kind of a gem. OJ, which is a nice little gem that kind of takes HTTP output headers and such and converts it to Ruby objects and makes them very readable. I like using OJ, it makes things easy to work with. And then RESTforce, which is Salesforce's gem to interact with the Salesforce API. I like RESTforce, it's a pretty good gem. I think it's better than just using pure Faraday, which I do for other things. This will use Faraday for like the Zendesk portion of it, but for the Salesforce, I found RESTforce is a fantastic gem, so I've been using that. The README's got a file tree, which is basically just saying, here's all the files. And then it shows the SOQL queries used for the main instance, but we'll go over that as we go over the script. So the main part of this would be obviously the GitLab CI file. That's what's going to actually run all the jobs and the fun stuff like that, which is what we'll actually use to actually do the sync. It does it in 3 stages: the gather data stage, the compare stage, and the sync stage. Fun fact about me, I'm not original in naming, so you can pretty much guess what each stage is doing. The before script, it's always going to do a ruby-v. This is just for debugging purposes if I ever need to look. Make sure it's using the right Ruby version. Occasionally I'll have an issue with like, oh, this was made in Ruby 2.6.5, but the Ruby version is 2.6.7. So it's good for me to be able to quickly see the Ruby version that it reported. That way I can look through it. We're going to run gem install bundler, and then we're going to run bundle. This will use the gem file that's in this repo to quickly install all the required gems. Obviously, it's in the before script because we need it to run these each time. We need to make sure we have the required gems to actually run, because the script's going to fail otherwise. Our gathered data stage pretty much is composed of the pre-sync ZD org report and the pre-sync SF org report. Like I said, not original in naming, but the pre-sync ZD org report is basically just gathering the Zendesk organizations. All it's going to do is on a schedule, it will run the gather Zendesk organization script. That'll create the artifact Zendesk.json, which will expire in 4 hours. And the pre-sync SF org report is going to run the gather Salesforce accounts script on a schedule, and it'll make 2 artifacts for us: the Salesforce.json, which will contain the syncable data, and then the Salesforce problem.json, which will contain other, the problems that basically say, I can't sync these, so here's a list of the problems, you should probably fix these. It's good for reference to find out why something hasn't synced or if there's duplicate naming issues and such. The compare stage will run the pre-sync org comparison report. This only runs via schedule. I've got it needing both of these pre-sync org reports here, which basically means this job will not run without those past two succeeding. The reason for that is it's going to run the compare organizations, which will use those artifacts from the previous jobs. And it's going to create the creates.json and the updates.json. Our final stage is the sync stage. That's going to run the sync organizations job. It runs via schedule as well. It needs this comparison report job to have completed because it's going to use the creates and updates.json files to actually sync the organizations. So I'm going to go over one of the scripts, and the reason I'm only going to go over one of them is because they pretty much all follow the same exact format. It's a Ruby script. I've got the frozen string literal, just RubyCop likes you to do that. I'm requiring the ZD-SFDC sync main file. And then I'm going to call the Zendesk Salesforce Sync main, Zendesk gather run. The other scripts basically do the same thing. The Salesforce one would run Salesforce, run, Salesforce gather, whatever it is. And the compare would run compare, and the sync will run Zendesk Sync run. They pretty much do the exact same thing. It's just so I can quickly call these files without having to tell the gem file, oh, require this, and then do this, and do this, and do this. It's a lot easier just to have the script files there. The gem file, it's not complex. You'll see it pretty much is just requiring JSON, OJ, and RESTforce. The reason I'm using 4.2.2 on this is sometimes Salesforce pushes major versions to this, and they change functions, they change classes radically. So I specifically know 4.2.2 works with this script, and I have tested it. As newer versions come out, I test those, make sure they're good, and then update this to use the newer versions. So that brings us to the lib files. The first one is the main one you saw us requiring, that's ZD-SFDC sync main.rb. And all this is doing is declaring the module Zendesk Salesforce Sync main. And then I've got these two right here, the require bundler setup and bundler required default. This is a really cool set of commands that basically just tells it, hey, require everything that was in the gem file. All those gems we installed, yeah, we need them, require them. I like it. I think it's a lot cleaner than saying require JSON, require OJ, require RESTforce. Especially if you end up having a gem file with like 20 gems. I don't want to have to put require for 20 different gems. This is a lot quicker and I think a little cleaner. Beyond that, we're going to require the ZD-SFDC sync main / client file. So let me go to that because that's the next part of this. So the client file, once again, we're calling that module Zendesk Salesforce Sync main. Unfortunately, you're probably going to get tired of me saying that exact wording because it is present a lot. Beyond that, we create a class client. From this client, I'm going to require the compare Salesforce and Zendesk files. And then we're going to create a couple functions that will be used by these other files. Retry options is just a hash that I've created. It says max, interval, randomness, backoff factor, exceptions. This is going to be passed to Faraday to tell it how to handle failures. Specifically, we want to handle connection failed and timeout error. If it occurs with these, it'll basically go to this, okay, I have 5 retries I can do. The interval between retries should start at a second. I want interval randomness at 0.5 and the backoff factor of 2. This is basically just saying I want intervals somewhere in the 0.5 to 1, in the somewhere 0.5 from the 1 second. So maybe half a second, maybe 1.5 seconds. The backoff factor is 2, basically saying, hey, you should back off between these retries just to make sure nothing happens. In this case, I got 2 seconds because Zendesk tends to require a second if it hits the connection failed timeout stuff. I did 2 seconds just to kind of be safe. And then 5 retries. At that point, if it fails past 5, it's just going to fail completely. But that's kind of what we would expect to happen. We want that to happen. The next thing we've got is the Salesforce Declaration. You'll notice I'm using these double pipe equals. That's a cool little trick in Ruby that basically says, set this variable to something unless it already has a value. So I can call this Salesforce function 15 times. It's only going to actually run this RESTforce new the first time. All the other times, it'll just use the object it's already built. This is a good little memory saver, at least in my opinion. There's everyone's got their perfect way of coding and has different opinions, but I found this is a really nice way to do it. Basically, in the new object, we're just declaring like the host, the username, the client ID, the secret, the security token, and the API version. Once again, 41.0 is the one that was recommended for 4.2.2. I think Salesforce's API is up to 51 now, but I have to test it out because, again, like some things change, endpoints change, and it also needs to correlate with what the gem is expecting. We also make a Zendesk function here, which basically just makes a Zendesk global variable. This one's actually using Faraday instead of a preset gem. And all I'm doing is setting a new Faraday connection to the Zendesk API URL. And in the config, I'm telling it, the request's retry value is these retry options from up here. The adapter is whatever the default Faraday adapter is. I want to make sure the content type is application JSON because we're going to be passing and receiving JSON from Zendesk, so it's important. Zendesk recommends to set it that way. It's not required on GET requests, but it is required on the put and the post that we'll use with syncs and creates and such. And then we've got the basic auth. This is making username / token and then using a Zendesk API token. As a fun note, basic auth is being deprecated in Faraday, so at some point in the near future, I'll probably have to change that to use the new method, which looks basically the same. Then we've got a function called request. This is taking an HTTP method, a URL, and a parameter, or parameters are option because it defaults them to a hash. And basically this is just using this Faraday connection to make a public send to the HTTP method. So get, post, put, delete, all that fun stuff. It's going to take a URL. This URL is going to be appended on the actual environment URL we set here. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then any parameters we are passing to it. And basically it's going to make this request, and then OJ is going to load the response body into a nice, pretty neat hash that we can easily parse. So beyond that, I guess we should look at the Zendesk, we'll look at the Salesforce stuff first, because that tends to be where I start when I build this stuff. So once again, we've got that Zendesk Salesforce Sync main module declaration. We're making a new class called Salesforce. This right here, this last thing assigned client is basically saying inherent from client. This is useful, so I don't have to say Zendesk Salesforce Sync main : client dot Salesforce to get that Salesforce function we made. Instead, I'll just be able to say Salesforce. It's already there. It's preloaded for us. Our run function that we saw from the script is going to do gather, verify, report, and artifacts. This is just a nice little wrapper function to do all these other things so that the scripts can be nice and simple and just say, yeah, just run the thing. It doesn't have to say, oh, do gather, then verify, then report, then artifacts. Instead, I've got a nice little wrapper function for me to do that. The gather script, or gather function, the gather function is just going to print out a nice message letting us know it's gathering the data, and it's going to call the data function, and then it's going to tell us when it's done. The data function is where we'll actually do the gathering. And what this is going to do is use that Salesforce object we built in the client. And it's going to call the query function, which will run an SOQL query. That's Salesforce Object Query Language, a lot like SQL. So if you're familiar with SQL, it'll look very familiar to you. But basically, we're going to run a query string, which we define down here. And then we're going to map this to account objects, which we'll go over in a bit. For duplicates, we'll go over this in a bit, but basically I'm making a variable called duplicates and running determine duplicates. This is just to get the duplicates so we can make that Salesforce problems.json file later. So our query string currently looks like this. It's gotten pretty big. Fun fact, it probably won't get smaller. It'll probably just get bigger and bigger as we sync more complex data. But a lot of this is just information we like to have in our Zendesk tickets, like the Salesforce ID and the account name and the ARR and the sales segmentation, the owner, the number of seats, the type, the TAM, the support level, the manual support upgrade in case of prospects, region, the Gainsight health score color, which is determined through a bunch of factors in Gainsight. Admittedly, I don't fully understand it, but the general sense is green is good, yellow is warning, and red is extreme warning. So probably, kind of universal with the colors there. Next renewal date is supposed to take all their subscriptions and calculate this is when their next expiration happens. And then we've got these are the newer parts of this, but I'm calling a select in this to get basically all the subscriptions they have that are active. This will be used later in the script to double check the support level, make sure everything's good to go. Kind of the same thing here, except this time we're gathering from Zuora subscriptions, and we're doing that where it's active. We found sometimes there's like a glitch in Zuora and it doesn't quite sync the subscriptions. So sometimes these customer subscriptions are blank, which for scripting purposes is bad because it's going to say, oh, they have no subscriptions. They must be expired, which isn't necessarily true. So what we're doing is gathering from both. It might be overkill in some cases, but overkill is actually good here. We'd rather overcheck than undercheck in this case, because expired customers don't get support, and we definitely don't want to do that to somebody who is actively paying for support. So beyond that, we've got this where clause. The account type, we only sync customer and former customer, or we'll sync prospect or prospect CE user, which I believe this is a deprecated type, but it's one we account for anyway. And we only sync those in cases where the manual support upgrade is true. And then we've got this where we're syncing this one specific account included in this. That's just because this account is a very special account. It doesn't quite hit the types it's supposed to. It wouldn't be covered by partner sync or the sync normally. So what we're doing is saying, yeah, include this account because it does need to be synced. It is important. They're an alliance partner. It's something we have to keep in mind. So it takes this query and runs it in Salesforce, and it's mapping each return from this query to an account object, which is going to start by running this check account. So we'll go over that real quick. Check account is basically going to look at the subscriptions, and it's going to determine the plans from them. It's going to look at Zuora subscriptions, and it'll determine the plans from them. And then it's going to call unique on the plans just to make sure we don't have duplicates. It's going to delete expired if there are other plans. It's going to map them out to make them nice and pretty. And then it's going to set the support level to the minimum, which is going to be basically we'll go over that in a bit. So determine plans, you'll see how we've got these numbers before each plan, like 9 expired, 7 community, 2 gold, 1 ultimate. The reason for these numbers is so that we can use this min function up here and basically say, right, ultimate and gold are going to be the highest ones we want to count for. Expired is the least one. When we say min, we're taking essentially the highest plan level and setting that to the support level up here. So beyond that, and that's basically all this check account is doing, is setting these subscriptions and the support levels so that it can figure out not only what is their true support level, but do they have other plans? This is good for accounting of, oh, well, they have ultimate and silver and bronze and starter. This will ensure that later in the sync, those tags get added to the org so they have all of that present. So beyond that, we have a couple of different things we do. We take the type from Salesforce, we do downcase, and we replace any spaces with underscores. That's to make it a nice, pretty format for Zendesk. We've got the determine priority support function, which I believe is down here. All this is doing is basically saying, well, yeah, it's false if it's a customer. It's false if it's a former customer. Otherwise, just return manual support upgrade. This is because only a prospect can be a priority prospect. So basically, there's no reason to say that's true unless they are a prospect. And in our case, well, if they're not a customer or former customer, they were a prospect. Beyond that, we've got determine region, which is literally just, I don't even know if we have, where is it? There we go. All this does is if it's blank, it's returning an empty space. Otherwise, it's just pre-pending it with the org region underscore stuff. That way it's in Zendesk format, and then it's downcasing the actual region itself. That's all just to make it in the format that Zendesk expects it in. It'll make it a lot easier to compare when we get that Zendesk data if they look the same. Subscriptions we get from those subscriptions we set down below. We set the health score to lowercase. But mostly this is just setting a hash in a specific format that we'll then use later to compare and make sure it's correct. So the verified data is just going to subtract duplicates from all that query data we got. And All the duplicates is doing is it's grouping all that data by the account's name, downcased, because we do not want to have to worry about case insensitivity, because Zendesk is case sensitive on the name. So I could call my account Bob, and then another one with lowercase Bob, and another one with all capitals Bob. As far as Zendesk is concerned, those are all three the same name. So they will error out because you can only have one account name. Account names are unique in Zendesk. But essentially, we're just we're grouping it by that, and we're calling the values, and then we're selecting any of them where the size of this grouping is over 1, meaning there are duplicate names. So that's how we're determining duplicates. And then we're basically just subtracting that from data because we cannot sync duplicates. There's no real way, scripting wise, we could look at 2 accounts with the same name and say, oh, that's clearly the right one. Until there's a point when someone says, oh, this field will tell you which one's the right one. And then we can kind of account for that a little better. But currently, no real way to know which one's the duplicate. So we do this and we subtract it, and we will report that in the Salesforce problems.json file. The report is just going to tell us, hey, I found this many accounts. This is how many duplicates I found. And then it's going to print out each duplicate account name so that we can easily see them in the CI job log. But it's also going to make these 2 artifacts, the Salesforce.json, which will have our data minus the duplicates, and then our Salesforce problems, which is just going to have our duplicates. And that's all there is to the Salesforce portion of the script. Real quick, does anybody have a question they want to voice before we go on? Cool, we'll go on to the next one. So we've got the Zendesk file. All this is doing is calling a class Zendesk and then requiring the gather and the sync scripts. So we'll go to those. We'll start with gather and we'll come back to sync since it's the final one. Once again, we declare that module, the Zendesk Salesforce Sync main. We call the class Zendesk, and then we're making a new class called gather. And once again, we're inheriting from client. That way I don't have to call Zendesk Salesforce main or sync main : client dot Zendesk dot request or whatever. I can instead just call request, call Zendesk. The run script is just going to generate the artifact and report. We don't have to do as much data integrity checking on this one because the data is already in Zendesk, and Zendesk has unique naming. And if the data was not correct in Zendesk, it wouldn't have synced to begin with. So all data does is gather the orgs, which all we're doing for that is essentially looping over the organizations.json API endpoint, and we're using the pagination, and we're going page by page to gather every single organization in Zendesk. As you can expect, since the max returns from the page is 100 orgs, and last I checked, we have something like 30, almost 40,000 orgs. This takes a bit of time. It has a lot to loop through. It takes a good chunk of API. Unfortunately, I have not found a more efficient way yet, but I am constantly working with Zendesk to see how I can improve how we do this. But essentially, all it's doing is taking these organizations and mapping them to organization objects. When it's done, it'll tell done. You'll notice I have it printing dots, so I can quickly check and debug later and see how many dots it went, how many pages it hit before it did timeout or something like that. At the end, I return orgs. Fun fact with Ruby, the last thing that is actually done in a function is the return if you don't explicitly say to return. So in this case, when I say orgs, it's returning orgs. So the org object, you'll notice it looks very, very similar to what Salesforce was doing because we're going to compare them and we want them to look as close as possible, with the exception of it's going to have a Zendesk ID and it's going to have tags. The rest of this, it'll be determined, but the support level, essentially the only thing this does is, return the support level. If it says it's starter, if it says it's basic, return it as starter because basic's an old name. Starter was the newer name, but we are deprecating starter and bronze. But for the time being, we don't want it to say, oh yeah, the support plan is basic because that's an old name. We don't use that at all. We want it to say starter. That's the name that we all recognize at this point. For determined subscriptions, all it's doing is taking this allowed set of subscription plan tags, which is starter, premium, ultimate, bronze, silver, gold, community, and custom. If you can't tell, I've had to type those and say those a lot, so I've gotten pretty good at saying them fast. But essentially, I'm duplicating the tags, which is what .dupe does. It basically says, give me an exact copy of what I just called. This is useful if I need to mangle what the tags in this case, but I don't want to actually edit the original tags. And basically from this, it's just selecting the allowed tags, so these, and it's basically saying, yeah, these are the subscriptions. If there were no subscriptions found, it's going to say it's expired. Otherwise, it's just going to return an array of subscription tags. And clean tags is kind of doing the same, but in the opposite, it has the allowed tags, it's duplicating the tags, and it's basically just deleting the plan tags because we're already handling those in subscriptions. And then it's calling a sort on them just so they're in nice, pretty format. That way we can compare them easily when we generate that in the compare script. That's because technically speaking, if you have an array that's ABC and another one that's CBA, they are not the same array. They do not equal one another because they're different orders. They have different index values. So sorting them ensures it will be in nice format. It's not to say we couldn't sort them later when we do the comparison. I just have it being done here. But that's all really the Zendesk gather does. It's basically just calling the API over and over and over again to get a bunch of organizations and then making them in a nice, pretty format. And at the end of this, it's making an artifact. There it is, called Zendesk.json. It will report how many orgs it found to sync, which is useful, but also something I could easily find in Zendesk's admin panel by just going to the organizations and seeing the count. So. But there is like a limit. I think after 100,000, they stop showing it. It just says 100,000 plus. So this will be useful at that point, but not really at this point. Any questions on the Zendesk gather side of this before I keep going? Cool. So the next thing that it does is the comparison. Once again, modules Zendesk Salesforce Sync main. We're calling the class compare. I don't need to inherit from client on this one because I'm not actually calling Salesforce or Zendesk. In this case, I'm just comparing two JSON files. I'm setting up some, I've got the compare, generate artifacts and report. That's what the run function does. I set some variables for myself. We got creates, updates, do nothing. These will be used on reporting and generating artifacts later. But the actual compare script is essentially going to determine the sync needs. This is a nice, pretty way of giving me a count of how many it's working on. It's going to be a rapid number that goes up. That's the /r at the end of this stuff is basically just going back and overwriting it. It's mostly just nice for when you run the script via CLI so I can see where it's at, because otherwise it says that but does nothing and you're like, I don't know if you're actually running. And one thing I get paranoid about is when a script says it's running and I run a script and no output, nothing's happening. I get a little paranoid of, did it freeze? Did my computer freeze? Is it running? So this is mostly just for myself, my own sanity, but anyone else who actually feels the same way. But beyond that, what it's essentially going to do is take the Zendesk organizations. And organizations, I believe we defined organizations. It's just going to read the Zendesk accounts. It's going to read the Salesforce file. But essentially what we're doing is it's doing a detect and saying, okay, so find me the organization that matches the Salesforce ID on the account itself, on the Salesforce return. What it's going to say is if you couldn't find that in Zendesk, it means we need to create it. So it's going to push this to creates, which we call up here. It's going to make a create object. We'll go over that in a bit. Otherwise, it's going to determine the updates unless Zendesk is nil. And when it's done, it'll say it's done. So determine updates just going to basically make a comparable object, which is a fun function that's saying I'm not comparing the Zendesk ID. That doesn't exist in Salesforce. I'm not comparing tags because that doesn't exist in Salesforce. I need to make sure all the subscriptions are sorted so they compare right. And I need to make the health score is, a string. This is for the few cases where it's empty and set to null and null won't compare to a string correctly. So that's literally what that's for, is just to make sure it's always set to an empty string if it was nil, I should say, sorry. And then it's returning that object. Basically what we're going to do is if the Salesforce object equals the Zendesk object, we don't have to do anything. It's in perfect sync, push to the do nothing variable. Otherwise, we push to the update variable and use the update object. So the create and update object is basically just putting this into the format we'll eventually pass to the Zendesk API to create or update it. In this case, we've got the name, the organization fields, and then from there, we've got most of the meat and potatoes of what we actually want. And then we've got the tags. For create, we don't have to worry about pre-existing tags because it didn't exist. For update, we do have to worry about the existing tags because we obviously don't want to overwrite some of the custom tags we've added. So we got to make sure that's there. And all the update tags do is it duplicates the, the tags from there. It makes sure it adds the subscription tags, and then it does a sort and a unique. Without the sort and without the unique, what you would have is like premium, 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 premium. And we obviously don't want to tell it to try to add that tag 15 times. So this just cleans that up. The sort is actually not necessary at this point, but I do it anyway, just in case I have to debug stuff. I like things in alphabetical order. But beyond that, we're going to create two artifacts, the creates and the updates.json, and then we're going to report on it. Here's how many we have to create, update, and do nothing about. And from there, it will go to the sync function. Before I go over the sync script, does anybody have any questions? Cool. So the Zendesk Sync is the final portion of this. And this one does inherit from the client because I'm going to have to call that Zendesk API. And the run is going to do a created, updated, errors, create orgs, sync orgs, reports. All created is doing is I'm calling these functions to set these variables because I'm going to be calling them a lot later to increment to them so I know what's going on. We've got the errors, which is just an empty array, but that will catalog errors that happen during the create portion. But yeah, so all create's doing is it's going over that creates artifact file, and it's once again doing that count for me, and it's just calling create org, which is making a post request to the organizations.json using that create object. So that's just taking the object we already have and doing the final, like this is the exact JSON format we have to send it in. If you don't send it in this way, it doesn't work right. And that's basically to say it's an organization, and then here's all that information. And at the end, we call to JSON to give it a giant JSON string that's exactly what Zendesk wants. I've played around a lot with it. If you don't give it exactly what it wants, it will annoyingly say it did something when it didn't. That's just the way it is. But if the response has an error in it, it will handle the error, which we'll go over in a bit, but essentially it's just putting an error string into the array for us. Otherwise, it's adding one to created, so we can report on it later. The update object is pretty much the same as the create object, but there's a bit of a difference in that we often have to update way more than create. So we're actually going to use the update mini API, which down here for the sync orgs, you can see we call like the sync is setting the organizations to this giant org object of the update objects, and then it's just doing a put request to organization/update mini. This allows me to take up to 100 and just do one giant bulk update, which is nice because otherwise we would need 100 API calls, and that is a ton of API calls. It will easily hit limits at that point. That's why you'll notice I take the updates and I slice them into 100. I like this Ruby function. It's pretty convenient. Of each slice integer basically says, yeah, so take this array and split it into objects that are 100 in size, and 2A is just setting them to an array, and then that's when we do the request to do the update mini. I have this giving a job status ID, which is mostly useless until we have to debug, and then I can quickly go look up that job status and actually see what happened. Super convenient to have it that way. And then basically we're just adding whatever the count of the organization's loop we're doing. The actual update org, this is something we're not actually using, but I kept it in here in case I need it in the future. But that's how you would update one specific organization. We used to do it that way, but again, like when we had to update 100 orgs, it took forever and it made 100 plus API calls. So we definitely didn't want to do that. Report's just going to tell us I created this many, I synced this many, and it'll print out any errors that happened. For the error report, it's literally just going to print out the error strings, which we got from this handle error. And all that is going to tell us is, the Salesforce ID could not be synced, and this is why. Most of the time, the why is duplicate name. So that's normally something we kind of check on and go figure out why there's one that exists in Zendesk but doesn't have the Salesforce ID. Normally it's because of a merge or account was deleted or something along those lines. Yeah, that's pretty much the end of the script at that point. That's pretty much the meat and potatoes of how this really works. But I'm sharing my screen here. But yeah, that's really the meat and potatoes of how the sync script works. That all runs via CI/CD on a schedule. I believe it's currently running every 30 minutes. It's using Zendesk environment variables and Salesforce environment variables to pass those to the script and run all of this. Yeah, so that's currently how we're doing that. You can see the kind of checks that are going into place to prevent false expires, and we're pretty consistently updating to always check for new edge cases that we find. But yeah, does anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments, any of that fun stuff?
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Regarding the CI consumption users, how do we keep track of them? Like I saw an organization in Salesforce, it was a prospect, and then they did not get any subscription. Instead, they just purchased CI and storage.
So CI, like, it's a really new problem that we've been trying to figure out. The basic stance we took was we're going to mark them as expired because they don't technically have a plan. But then we've got Zendesk itself configured of if they select their consumption, it will say, okay, they don't have a paid plan, but they are consumption. It adds a consumption only tag via triggers, and that gives them a consumption SLA, so they still get an SLA. So that's kind of how we're handling it here. Like on the Salesforce side, they don't have a plan. It doesn't show as a support level. That's not accounted for currently. It's not to say in the future there won't be a new like support level or something along that added called like consumption only or something, at which point we can sync that over and set up Zendesk to handle it that way and clean up some things. But currently, because they don't have a plan and they would be classified as expired, when they pass over to, to Zendesk, we have it configured that if the customer selects their consumption and they don't have a paid plan, to mark them as consumption only and give them SLA. With the updates to the script, most of them are actually getting the custom tag, which is much better than saying they're expired. At which point the same kind of concept, goes into play of they'll say their consumption on their forms when they submit their tickets, they'll get that consumption only tag, they'll get an SLA, then they get the assistance that they're looking for.
Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem. You'll probably see tickets with the custom tag more often now. That's basically just the script's way of saying they had a subscription, but I had no way of knowing what this is. And a good example is like they bought 1,000 CI minutes. Cool, that doesn't translate to any plan. I have no idea what that is. The script doesn't know what it is. So it says custom, it's something, we just don't know what it is. Those with custom tags will show in that free tickets view. Currently, remove the tag if they have a paid plan, not a big deal. If they don't, it's good that they're showing somewhere. Cool. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Right on. Well, I'll call it like that. Hope this was educational. I hope this was useful. And yeah, look forward to seeing y'all in the future.